The sun was setting, painting the dusty landscape in shades of gold and orange as Jack stumbled through the hellscape of a forgotten battlefield. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning metal and flesh mingling with the distant roar of artillery. He wasn't supposed to be here. Hell, he wasn't supposed to be alive. He just wanted a quick drink, a fast meal, and maybe a few hours of peace. A simple patrol turned into a nightmare when the enemy, some rebel militia no one had bothered to take seriously, launched an assault on their convoy, and everything went to hell. It had started as a few stray bullets, then an explosion, then the entire sky seemed to open up and rain death. Jack had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, as usual. He was crouched behind a wrecked Humvee, trying to keep his head down while his squad moved into position. His rifle felt heavy, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was the growing realization that this was the part of the war where everyone started to die. A distant voice in his earpiece barked orders, but Jack's focus was elsewhere. His fingers had started to feel numb, and a warm trickle of blood ran down the side of his face. Not his blood. Somebody else's. A few yards away, a soldier from his unit collapsed to the ground, his arms twitching in the final throes of death, his body slowly becoming one with the dirt and mud. The sound of gunfire was constant, but the real noise was inside Jack's head, the rushing, terrifying noise of his pulse, the roaring in his ears, the panic building as the realization sank in. He tried to move. His legs weren't responding. Panic swirled in his gut, thickening by the second. Then, it happened. A bullet whizzed through the air, the shockwave hitting him hard, slamming into his chest. The world went black. The last thing he remembered was his lungs burning, as though every breath was an attempt to hold back the inevitable. When Jack woke up, he wasn't sure if he was dead. The sterile, pale white of the lab ceiling above him felt like an alien sky. The beeping of machines, the quiet hum of something electrical, it all sounded like the faraway hum of a dream. His chest hurt, his skin felt tight, and a strange metallic taste clung to the inside of his mouth. He tried to sit up but found his limbs stiff, his body too heavy. For a moment, panic flared again, but then a figure stepped into view. "Colonel Saunders, good to see you awake, Jack," the colonel said, his voice gruff but somehow relieved. He didn't seem the least bit surprised to see Jack alive, and that worried Jack more than anything. He didn't even know how long he'd been unconscious. A day? A week? "Where am I?" Jack asked, his voice weak and raspy. His throat burned like sandpaper. It was hard to focus, like trying to look through fog. "Not where you thought you'd be," Saunders replied, the corners of his mouth twitching up in a tight smile. "You're at a classified research facility. We had to bring you in for emergency medical treatment." "Emergency?" Jack croaked, then looked down at his body. His military uniform had been cut away. His chest was wrapped in bandages, and his legs felt strangely warm, as if they were made of metal. He reached up to touch his head and found the skin there smooth, almost unnaturally smooth. "Hold on, Jack," Saunders said, his expression turning serious. "You've been through something extraordinary." Jack tried to push himself up again, this time more deliberately. His muscles screamed, but he managed to sit up. There was a moment of dizziness before it passed, replaced by a sharp, gnawing hunger deep in his gut. "Extraordinary?" Jack muttered, still trying to piece together the pieces. "I don't remember much. What happened to me?" "Your injuries," Saunders said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "They were severe. We took extreme measures. A new experimental procedure was put into place, nanotechnology designed to accelerate healing. You were on the verge of dying, Jack. You don't know how close you were. So we made a call." Jack looked at the colonel, his mind racing. "Nanotechnology?" "Yep. Tiny robots, microscopic. They work to rebuild cells, repair tissue, regenerate what's been damaged. We injected you with a higher dose than normal to speed up recovery. You were seconds away from bleeding out. That was the only option. But now, Jack clenched his fists. The room was starting to feel too small. His stomach was twisting, gnawing at him, but not just because he was hungry, it was something else. Something wrong. Something that was beginning to feel like it was coming from the inside out. What's happening to me? Jack said, his voice tighter now. The feeling inside him wasn't just discomfort, it was something darker. Something more primal. Jack, before Saunders could finish, Jack's body lurched forward. He didn't even have time to react. His arms shot out, grabbing the table beside him, and a strange sensation surged through him, hunger. No, it wasn't hunger. It was devouring. His eyes widened as a flash of memory hit him, something about the battle, a flash of light, then the numbness. Then it was gone, replaced by the sensation of his body stretching, the muscles beneath his skin pushing out, as though they were hungry for something. Anything. The table he was holding on to creaked under the pressure of his grip. The metal groaned. What the hell is happening to me? Jack gasped, panic rising in his chest. His hands trembled, and before he could stop himself, the table began to shift. It wasn't just bending, it was disintegrating under his fingers, the metal becoming liquid, melting like wax under heat. Jack. Hold on. Saunders shouted, but Jack was no longer listening. He was too distracted by the thing happening inside him, the thing that was growing, spreading. That he pulled his hand away, stumbling to the side, and the metal table that had been disintegrating followed him. Pieces of it floated in the air, following him like obedient pets. His mind was foggy, but the sheer terror of what was happening forced him to stand, to try to get away, but his legs buckled beneath him. He dropped to the floor, his mind going blank for a moment. His breath was shallow, and there was a deep, gnawing need inside him. What the hell did you do to me? Jack shouted, his voice breaking. Saunders stepped back, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fear. It wasn't supposed to go like this. The nanobots weren't supposed to take over. They were supposed to heal you, not consume. Jack's hands shook. His pulse pounded in his temples, and he could feel the gnawing hunger intensifying. Jack, Saunders said slowly, his voice full of dread. The nanobots, they've overloaded. They're replicating too quickly. They're no longer just healing you. They're changing you. You're becoming something else. Jack looked down at his hands. The skin was still smooth, but it was no longer just skin, it was alive, shifting, writhing beneath his fingertips. He could feel the nanobots moving inside him, spreading out like an infection, consuming everything they touched. Stop, Jack whispered, but it was too late. The transformation had already begun. The panic in Jack's chest was growing, but it was quickly overshadowed by something more primal, hunger. The world around him began to distort, as though reality itself was warping in response to the shifting, multiplying nanobots within his body. His vision blurred, and a metallic taste flooded his mouth. He could feel the microscopic machines burrowing deeper into his tissues, wrapping themselves around his organs like a second, invasive skeleton. His heart hammered in his chest, and with each beat, it seemed as though the sensation of devouring grew stronger. He staggered to his feet, his body feeling as though it were stretched too thin, too tightly wound. He reached out to steady himself, his fingers brushing against the edge of the table again. The surface shuddered, and this time, it didn't just bend, it ripped apart under his touch. It was like pulling apart a sheet of paper soaked in water, the metal unraveling into particles, disintegrating, dissolving into the air. Jack's breath quickened. The urge to consume was unbearable, like a hunger he had never known before. His mind screamed for him to stop, to control it, but the sensation was overpowering, like a tidal wave crashing over him. He felt the nanobots feeding off his every cell, spreading through his bloodstream and making him more than human. The walls seemed to close in. The floor beneath his feet felt like it was giving way, the air thick with a choking, metallic scent. It wasn't just his body that was changing. It was the world around him, turning into something Fragile. Something that could be swallowed whole. Jack. Saunders' voice was sharp, but distant, as if the Colonel himself was being swept away by the chaos inside Jack's mind. Control yourself. You've got to fight it. Jack's eyes locked on Saunders, but it felt like the Colonel was fading from view, swallowed by the haze of black that was crawling over his vision. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. He was too distracted by the unbearable need inside him, the constant, gnawing hunger that no amount of reasoning could overcome. Jack staggered back, his mind scrambling for answers. The military facility was crumbling around him, metal and glass shifting, warping as though the very walls were alive and responding to his condition. The air was heavy with tension, charged with the growing energy that surrounded him. The nanobots were alive, and so was he. In a daze, Jack moved forward, almost instinctively. His hands reached for another piece of equipment, something to hold on to ground himself. His fingers brushed against the steel of a nearby console. The moment they made contact, the material didn't just bend, it melted, liquefying under his touch like butter under a hot knife. His eyes widened, but even as the console dissolved into thin air, Jack's mind couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. He could only feel it. The devouring. His body seemed to shift and expand in ways he couldn't control. His arms were suddenly longer, the muscles rippling beneath his skin as if trying to stretch out of him, into the world around him. The nanobots were growing stronger, multiplying faster, and with every movement, they pulled more of the surrounding world into his body. What the hell is going on? Jack managed to force the words out, his voice low and strained, almost unrecognizable. You're transforming, Saunders said, his voice tinged with fear and fascination. The nanobots have begun to take over your physiology, Jack. It's not just repairing you anymore. It's rewriting your genetic code. You're becoming something else, something that can consume everything in its path. No, this isn't real. This can't be real, Jack muttered, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog in his mind. He looked down at his hands, his once human hands, now slick with the dissolved remnants of the equipment he had touched. The skin wasn't just skin anymore. It was shifting, moving, alive with the nanobots that had overtaken it. It was a grotesque, almost alien transformation. This wasn't what he had signed up for. This wasn't part of the plan. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. He could feel his pulse thrumming in his ears, his body trembling, not from fear but from the strange, invasive power coursing through him. It wasn't just his body, his mind was starting to unravel, too. He could hear the hum of the nanobots inside him, their metallic whispers growing louder and louder with every passing second. Consume. Expand. Feed. The voices echoed in his mind, distant but unmistakable. Jack's heart raced. The nanobots weren't just repairing him, they were taking over. They were becoming him. Jack, listen to me, Saunders urged. You have to focus. The only way to control this is to fight the programming. Don't let them take over completely. You can still, but Jack wasn't listening. His body was no longer his own. The walls of the lab, the floor beneath his feet, even the air around him felt like it was calling to him, a siren song of consumption. The hunger surged again, and this time, it was unstoppable. His body surged forward, driven by something deeper, darker, a primal urge to devour everything within reach. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the nearest wall, and before he even realized what was happening, his hands were pressed against it, his fingers digging into the concrete. The wall began to melt, not just bend, not just break. It melted. Saunders shouted something, but Jack couldn't hear him. He was no longer human. He wasn't even Jack anymore. He was a thing, a force, a devouring entity that could consume anything in its path. His mouth opened wide, but it wasn't for speech, it was for feeding. The hunger inside him was unbearable, like an ocean crashing over him, and before he could stop himself, his lips stretched open, and the wall in front of him began to dissolve into his body. The concrete, the steel, the air itself, everything around him was fair game. His body pulled everything into itself, like a black hole, an insatiable void, and it wasn't just the walls. It was everything. Everything in the room, everything in the facility. It all began to dissolve, to vanish, as if the world were being erased by an unseen force. And that force was him. Jack didn't know how long he had been consuming the facility. It felt like hours, but in truth, he had no concept of time anymore. His body had expanded, grown in ways that were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. His hands were now huge, thick and coated in layers of absorbed material, his arms seemingly made of pure energy. Every step he took left cracks in the ground, as though he was moving through a fragile, decaying world. He paused for a moment, panting, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it was hard. So hard. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were crowded by the voices of the nanobots, the strange commands that buzzed in his mind. Consume. Expand. Feed. Jack. Saunders' voice came again, distant but clear enough for him to hear. You have to stop. You're losing yourself. If you keep going. But Jack wasn't listening. The hunger demanded more. It was relentless, and there was nothing left inside him to resist it. He felt the surge again, the wave of energy, the need to take everything. His body reacted before his mind could stop it. His hands shot out again, tearing through the steel doors of the facility like they were made of paper. The world around him began to melt, to crumble. The structure, the very foundation, was falling apart. And Jack, he was the cause. He was the devourer. And then, amidst the destruction, amidst the chaos of his own making, there was a voice. Not the voices of the nanobots. A real voice. Jack. It was Sarah. Jack froze. For a moment, the hunger subsided. His vision cleared. He could see her, Sarah Kim, standing in the doorway of the wrecked lab, looking at him with wide eyes. She was no longer in uniform. She was wearing civilian clothes, but it didn't matter. She was there. She was the only thing that still mattered, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack hesitated. Jack, please, Sarah said, her voice trembling. You don't have to be this. You can still fight this. You can fight them. Jack looked down at his hands. The dark energy inside him was still there, a gnawing presence at the edge of his consciousness. But something else had been sparked inside him. A flicker of recognition. A flicker of humanity that he wasn't just a weapon. He wasn't just a devourer. He was Jack. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to stop it. But the clock was ticking, and the hunger was only getting stronger. Jack's eyes stayed locked on Sarah as she stepped into the ruined lab, her gaze full of something he couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something like hope. It was strange, how her presence made everything feel real again. Like a small anchor in the chaos of his mind. Jack, she said again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. You can fight this. I know you can. He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But the gnawing hunger deep inside him was overwhelming. His hands, still slick with the remnants of the facility, twitched at his sides. The nanobots inside him were screaming for more, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Consume. Feed. Expand. Jack tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his voice cracked, weak and distant. The words felt foreign to him, slipping out of his control. His hands clenched, and the hunger flared again, sharp and demanding. He could feel the nanobots moving beneath his skin, like ants crawling through his veins, tearing at his body. His body wasn't his anymore. Not entirely, but Sarah, she was still there. She hadn't run. She wasn't afraid of him, not in the way everyone else was. She was still looking at him, waiting for him to make a choice. Jack, please, she whispered, taking a tentative step forward. I know you're in there. I know you're still you. Her voice broke through the chaos, like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, like she actually believed in him. Like she believed he could still be Jack and not just the thing that was consuming the world around him. He swallowed hard. His chest heaved with the effort to breathe, to fight back the suffocating tide of nanobots. His body wanted to obey their commands, to devour everything in sight, but he didn't want that. He couldn't be that, Sarah. The word felt heavy on his tongue. His eyes stung, his vision clouded, but he had to speak, had to make her understand. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I know, she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know you're fighting it, Jack. But you can beat this. You just need to hold on a little longer. I can help you. I promise. Jack closed his eyes, trying to block out the onslaught of voices in his head, the relentless, hungry voices that were growing louder with each passing second. It was like they were drowning him, forcing him to give in. He clenched his fists, trying to summon whatever strength he had left. He had to focus. He had to control it. Stop, he whispered to himself, as much to the nanobots as to Sarah. I don't want to be this. I don't want to become that. He could hear the voice of the nanobots now, clearer than ever, like they were inside his skull. Consume. Destroy. Feed. Expand. No, Jack said, more forcefully this time. No, his hands shook. He could feel the nanobots moving beneath his skin, an insidious crawling sensation, a constant whispering, urging him to give in. His muscles tensed, his entire body straining against the pressure. Fight them, he told himself. Fight this. The voice of the nanobots flickered, then started to lose its edge. It was as though they were confused, their commands weakening, interrupted by the force of Jack's will. He wasn't just trying to fight the hunger, he was trying to reassert control over his own body. And it wasn't easy. It felt like trying to wrestle with something far stronger than himself, something that didn't even belong to him anymore. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something clicked. He remembered something, the thing that had been forgotten in all the madness. He remembered who he was. He wasn't just some lab experiment, some monster. He was Jack. A soldier, yes, but more than that. He was human. I won't let you take me, Jack growled, his voice rough and hoarse. He could feel the nanobots scrambling, trying to regain control, but it was too late. He was pushing back, fighting against them with every ounce of strength he had left. It was like the storm inside him was slowly starting to settle. The hunger, the need to consume, faded just a little bit. He could breathe again. He could think again. Sarah, he said, his voice trembling but stronger now. Help me. I need to stop them. Her face softened with relief, though there was still fear in her eyes. I'm here, Jack. I'm not going anywhere. With a final, desperate push, Jack forced himself to take control, overriding the nanobot's influence. It was a struggle, a war within his own body, but it worked. For now, at least, Jack let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling at his sides. The world around him felt less like it was breaking apart, less like it was being devoured by his own hunger. He wasn't fully in control, not yet. But for the first time since he'd woken up in the lab, it felt like there was a chance. Okay, Jack whispered, his voice raw, exhausted. I'm still me. I'm still me. Sarah moved closer, her eyes searching his face as if to confirm that he was really there. That he was still Jack. You are, she said softly. And we're going to fix this. I promise. But Jack wasn't so sure anymore. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the nanobots inside him weren't something that could just be fixed, they were a part of him now. A permanent part. Even if he managed to control them for a moment, they would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to take over again. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice now steadier, more determined. "We need to get out of here. The longer I'm here, the harder it's going to be to hold on." Sarah nodded. "Right. There's a way out through the east exit. I've already sent a message to HQ. They'll be expecting us." Jack shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "HQ? I don't think they're going to be too thrilled to see me. Not after this." "We'll figure it out," Sarah said, more firmly this time. "But we have to move fast. You're not the only one who's been affected by this nanotechnology, Jack. They've been testing it on others. And the military has plans that—" "I know," Jack cut her off, his eyes flashing. "I saw what they were doing. They want to weaponize this. Turn people into monsters. They want to turn me into a weapon." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darkening. "That's what I'm afraid of. And if we don't get out of here before they realize you're still alive, they'll come for us. All of us. They'll stop at nothing to—" "I won't let them," Jack interrupted. His voice was steady now, his mind sharp. He wasn't about to let the military use him, or anyone else, as a pawn in their experiments. They'd already taken too much. He turned to Sarah, a fierce determination burning in his chest. "We need to shut this down. The nanotech. The program. Everything." Sarah nodded, her expression hardening. "I'm with you." Without another word, Jack began to move. He wasn't sure how much time he had, or how much of himself he could keep in check, but he knew one thing: he couldn't do this alone. He couldn't face the military, the experiments, and the growing hunger inside him without someone there to help him keep his humanity intact. They reached the east exit in record time, and as Jack moved through the crumbling hallways, he could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. There was no going back from this. He was now a living weapon, a ticking time bomb of nanotechnology. But there was still a chance to stop the people who had turned him into this. A chance to make sure no one else ever became a devourer like he was, and that was worth the fight. As Jack and Sarah moved through the broken hallways of the military complex, the silence that hung between them was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the cracked concrete. Jack could feel the nanobots inside him, shifting, reacting to every movement, every pulse of his heartbeat. They were hungry, restless. But for now, they stayed dormant, as if sensing the struggle within him. He couldn't trust them, couldn't trust himself, but he couldn't afford to break down now. Sarah's quick, measured steps were the only thing keeping him grounded, her presence a tether to whatever was left of his humanity. She was close now, guiding him through the maze of corridors, her eyes darting nervously as they approached the exit. The urgency in her movements was palpable. The quicker they got out, the better. "The military wasn't far behind, Jack," Sarah said, her voice low but steady. "We don't have long. I sent a message, but they'll trace it. We need to get to the rendezvous point before—" "I know," Jack interrupted, his voice tight with frustration. "Before they send in the whole damn army to hunt us down." Sarah glanced at him, a hint of unease flickering across her face. She wasn't used to seeing Jack like this, not this broken, not this other. She didn't understand how quickly he was losing himself, how the hunger was growing with every passing moment. But she wasn't asking questions. She was moving, leading him through the wreckage of the facility like it was second nature. "We're almost there," she said, glancing back at him with a small, encouraging smile. But Jack knew it was more out of habit than real belief. They both knew the truth. Even if they made it to the rendezvous, even if they escaped the complex, the fight was far from over. Every turn they took seemed to bring them closer to something else, something darker. It wasn't just the military that was after them anymore. It was the very technology that had been grafted into Jack's body, turning him into something he barely recognized. The nanobots inside him were alive, aware, and they were getting stronger. He could feel it in the weight of his limbs, in the pulsing thrum beneath his skin. The exit was just ahead. He could see the faded emergency lights casting long, ghostly shadows across the cracked walls. His pulse quickened as they approached. But as they rounded the final corner, Jack's stomach sank. The air felt wrong. "Wait," he whispered, his voice low, cautious. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, turning to him with wide eyes. "What's wrong?" "Something's off," Jack muttered, his senses on high alert. He could hear it now, low, distant voices echoing from the other side of the exit doors. He could feel the faint vibrations of movement, like footsteps that didn't belong. They were too quiet, too methodical. "They've got people outside," Jack said, his eyes narrowing as he strained to listen. His heart pounded in his chest, the hum of the nanobots inside him growing louder, responding to the threat, to the presence of other soldiers closing in. "Shit," Sarah cursed under her breath. "We need to move, Jack." "If they're waiting for us, I know," Jack said, his mind racing. The hunger flared again, sharp and unrelenting. The nanobots within him were stirring, feeding off the adrenaline coursing through his veins, urging him to act. He clenched his fists, trying to fight back the wave of hunger that threatened to consume him. He couldn't let them take control again, not now. Not when they were so close to escaping, but Sarah was already moving, already pulling him toward the exit. She'd made up her mind. And Jack knew, even before she spoke, that there was no going back now. "Follow me," she said, her voice firm with authority. "We're not turning back." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath as they both reached the exit doors. The sound of muffled voices grew louder, closer. It was now or never. The door swung open with a low groan of protest, and they slipped into the shadows outside. The night air hit Jack like a cold slap to the face, sharp and real. They were out. But they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The military complex was built into the side of a cliff, surrounded by dense forest. The rendezvous point was a small clearing a few miles away, but even that didn't guarantee safety. Jack could already hear the faint hum of military vehicles in the distance, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. They didn't have much time. "Stay close," Sarah whispered, her breath shallow as she moved quickly, guiding Jack through the dark woods. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the path as they hurried forward. Jack's body was on edge, every sense heightened by the danger around them. But it wasn't just the soldiers he had to worry about. It was the hunger. His stomach churned as the need to feed clawed at him. The nanobots were insistent, their demands unyielding, and every step felt like a battle to keep them at bay. His hands twitched with the urge to reach out, to consume the world around him. But he held it together, for now. He had to. For Sarah. For himself. "You're doing good, Jack," Sarah said, her voice just above a whisper. "We're almost there. Just a little further." Jack couldn't reply. The hunger was too strong, too loud. The nanobots inside him were pushing him to do things he couldn't control. He could feel his skin pulling tight, his muscles aching with the strain of holding back. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. They kept moving, their footsteps quick and silent in the soft earth. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot made Jack's heart race. The military was close. Too close, and then, from the corner of his eye, Jack saw it, a flash of movement. He froze, every muscle in his body locking up as his eyes darted toward the source. There, just at the edge of the forest, standing in the shadows, were figures, 3 of them. Soldiers. Waiting. That it happened in an instant. Before Jack could even process the threat, one of them stepped forward, his hand raised, a flash of metal glinting in the dark. Jack's mind screamed at him to move, but his body was already reacting before he could make a decision. The hunger surged. He didn't think. He didn't have time to think. His body lunged forward, his arms snapping out, and the soldier closest to him barely had time to react before Jack's hands were upon him. The nanobots in his skin surged, responding to the need, the instinct. The soldier's weapon, some sort of high-powered rifle, was torn from his hands in an instant, shattered into 1,000 pieces as Jack's fingers raked across the metal. But it wasn't just the weapon. Jack's body moved faster than he could keep up with, his hands clamping down on the soldier, pulling him in. The man's scream was cut off as Jack's mouth opened wide, too wide, and without thinking, he consumed that it wasn't like he had a choice. The nanobots inside him demanded it. The soldier's body began to disintegrate under Jack's touch, flesh and bone breaking apart as the nanobots dissolved it, pulled it into Jack's body. His limbs stretched, his form growing, morphing as he absorbed the soldier's mass. The others were already reacting, but it was too late. Jack was faster. Stronger. A monster, but still Jack. Sarah's voice broke through the haze. Jack. No. But it was already happening. Jack's head was spinning. The moment his body had consumed the first soldier, the hunger had exploded, spreading like wildfire through his veins, igniting every nerve with a ravenous heat. He couldn't stop himself. The nanobots were too strong, too pervasive. They controlled him now. He could feel them crawling beneath his skin, filling every fiber of his being. Feed. Expand. Consume. The words echoed in his mind like a mantra, a command he couldn't disobey. The soldier's body, now a twisted mass of disintegrating flesh, had already been absorbed, vanished into Jack's own form. His body felt different now, bigger, more powerful. The hunger was momentarily sated, but it would never be enough. He could feel it gnawing at him, an insatiable void that would never truly be filled. Jack. Sarah shouted, her voice breaking through the fog of his senses. She was backing away, her eyes wide with terror. What are you? But Jack didn't hear her. The hunger, the need, was all-consuming. He turned toward the other two soldiers, his hands twitching, reaching for them instinctively. His body moved without his permission, a blur of motion as he closed the distance between them in seconds. The second soldier raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Jack. He was shaking, his face pale with fear, but he didn't hesitate. He fired. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even feel the bullets as they hit his chest and shoulders. The nanobots inside him were already repairing the damage, healing him faster than the human eye could follow. His body was a machine now, no longer bound by the frailty of flesh and bone. He was a weapon, a living, breathing weapon. Before the soldier could react, Jack was upon him. His hand shot out, grabbing the soldier by the throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. The man's feet kicked frantically, but it was no use. Jack's strength was far beyond anything he had ever known, and it only grew stronger with each passing second. Stop. Sarah's voice was pleading now, her eyes frantic. She was moving toward him, but there was fear in her every step. Jack could hear her, but it was like her words were coming from miles away, lost in the haze of his hunger. He tightened his grip on the soldier's throat. The man's hands scrabbled at Jack's arm, trying to break free, but it was hopeless. Jack's vision blurred. The nanobots were urging him forward, demanding he finish what he had started. He could hear them whispering in his mind, pushing him, goading him to consume. Jack's mind screamed, trying to hold on to something, anything, that wasn't this. But it was so hard. His body was moving without him. The hunger was overwhelming. Jack. Sarah cried, her voice a sharp crack in the night. Please, stop. For a split second, Jack's gaze locked onto hers. Her face was pale, her expression torn between horror and desperation. Her eyes weren't just afraid of what he had become, they were afraid of losing him entirely. That thought pierced through the fog in his mind. No, he thought. I can't do this. Not to her. He let out a ragged breath and, with every ounce of willpower he had left, released the soldier. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air, but Jack didn't have time to process what had just happened. The hunger was still there, clawing at him. The third soldier was backing away now, his eyes darting between Jack and Sarah, panic taking hold of him. Jack's vision sharpened as he focused on the last target, his legs moving before he could even decide to follow through. But just as he lunged forward, Sarah stepped in his path. "Jack, stop," she shouted, her hands raised, pleading. "You're not a monster. You can fight this." For the first time, Jack hesitated. He stopped, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the nanobots thrumming inside him, restless, hungry, begging him to give in. But Sarah's voice, her face, her presence, held him in place. It was the only thing that kept the darkness from fully swallowing him. "Jack," she said softly, her voice trembling, but resolute. "You don't have to do this. You're still you. You can control it." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The nanobots were screaming in his mind, consume, destroy, expand, but Sarah's words, her belief, were a tether he didn't want to let go of. He swallowed hard, his entire body straining against the overwhelming urge to tear the soldier apart, to give in to the machine inside him. I don't know if I can control it," Jack rasped, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. I can't stop it." "You can," she insisted, taking a step closer. "You are stopping it. You're still Jack, not a weapon. You can beat this. Please. I know you can." Her voice, calm, steady, brought him back from the edge, just enough for him to see past the hunger for a moment. The soldier in front of him was still alive, his eyes wide with terror, but Jack couldn't focus on him anymore. His mind was still caught between the raw, primal instinct to consume and the need to stay human. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. He could barely recognize the words that came from his mouth. "I didn't want this. I never wanted this." The nanobots inside him stirred, pushing him, urging him to end it. But Jack refused. He fought. He dug deep, summoning the last of his willpower to shut them down, to force them into submission. For a moment, it felt like he was fighting a battle that could never be won, but then, slowly, painfully, he regained some semblance of control. The hunger began to recede, its grip loosening ever so slightly. He could feel the weight of the nanobots inside him, but now, it wasn't as suffocating. He wasn't entirely free of them, but he was fighting back. And that was something. Jack's body trembled as he collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He felt weak, exhausted, like he'd just run a marathon. The soldier in front of him was still trembling, but Jack barely registered him now. His entire focus was on Sarah. "You're still here," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "After everything, you're still here." Sarah knelt beside him, her face full of worry and something else, something softer. "I told you, Jack," she said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since the nanobots had taken control of him, Jack felt something close to relief. He wasn't in control yet, not fully. He was still a ticking time bomb of nanotechnology, but as long as Sarah was by his side, he could fight it, and that was enough. For now. But in the back of his mind, a cold, terrifying thought lingered. The military wouldn't give up so easily. They had their eyes on him, and they wouldn't stop until they had everything, and Jack, whether he liked it or not, was the key. The cool night air rushed over Jack's face as he sat there, trembling, on the edge of the forest path. The hunger was still there, a dull roar in the back of his mind, but it was manageable now. For the moment, at least. He focused on breathing, trying to regain control of his body, to remind himself that he was still Jack. He wasn't just the thing the military had made him into. He wasn't just a weapon. Sarah knelt beside him, her eyes soft with concern but determined, never wavering. She had stayed by him through all of this, through the worst of it, never once backing away from the monster he feared he was becoming. That thought nearly broke him. She had so much faith in him, in the man he used to be, the man he could be again. But every second, every moment, was a battle. It wasn't just about escaping the military or the experiments anymore. It was about holding on to the last shred of himself before it slipped away entirely. "Jack," Sarah said softly, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. "We can't stay here. The military will be looking for us. They know we're close. We need to get to the rendezvous point. Now." Her words had the desired effect. A sharp jolt of adrenaline shot through him, and he pushed himself to his feet, forcing his body to obey. His legs felt like jelly, shaky and uncertain, but he stood nonetheless. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not when they were so close. Jack nodded, though his eyes remained unfocused for a moment as the hunger gnawed at him again. The nanobots were restless, shifting beneath his skin, whispering their insistent demands. Feed. Expand. Consume. It was like a constant hum, a steady pulse in his veins, and the moment he let his guard down, just for a second, they would rise up, take control. But he couldn't let that happen. Not in front of Sarah. Not when they were so close. "Let's go," he rasped, his voice thick with effort. He clenched his fists at his sides, ignoring the slight tremor in his hands as he started to walk. Sarah moved beside him, keeping pace, though her eyes never left him. He could feel her watching, weighing every step, every breath. But she didn't say anything. She knew. She knew he was barely holding on, and all she could do was stay by him, to remind him that he wasn't alone. The path through the woods was narrow, overgrown with tangled roots and thorny bushes, but they pushed forward, moving as quickly as they dared. The distant sound of military vehicles still echoed through the trees, faint but unmistakable. They were getting closer, no doubt combing the forest for any sign of them. But Jack couldn't let the fear consume him. "They were almost there. We need to stay low," Jack murmured, his voice strained. His body was already reacting to the environment. Every branch, every rustle of the wind, felt amplified, like the nanobots were listening, sensing the slightest change in his surroundings. His heightened senses were a gift and a curse. Sarah nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She didn't ask questions anymore. She had seen enough, known enough by now, to understand the urgency. Every second was a ticking clock. Jack's transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional. They couldn't afford to waste time, couldn't afford to risk a mistake. They reached the clearing in record time, and Jack's heart thudded in his chest when he saw the rendezvous point, a small, dilapidated structure camouflaged by the surrounding trees. The area was quiet, too quiet, and Jack's instincts flared, every muscle coiled with tension. This wasn't right. There was no sign of the extraction team, no movement, no sound of the helicopter or vehicles. The military could be just minutes away. "Where are they?" Sarah whispered, looking around anxiously. Her hand gripped Jack's arm, her fingers tight with worry. "This isn't right. They should be here by now." "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice low and tense. He scanned the area, his senses heightened as he listened for any sign of movement. The air felt thick with anticipation. The feeling of being hunted pressed in on him like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Every shadow in the trees seemed to hide something. The hunger inside him shifted again, a familiar gnawing feeling that made his skin crawl. "I don't like this," Jack muttered. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the trees ahead. Jack froze, his muscles tightening as he snapped his head toward the sound. His hands twitched at his sides, ready to react before his brain could even catch up. The nanobots were stirring again, their whispers turning into screams. "Feed. Destroy. Consume. Jack." Sarah began, but she was cut off as figures emerged from the darkness. At first, Jack couldn't process it. The figures moved in with eerie precision, like shadows crossing through the trees. There were too many of them, far more than he'd expected. Too many for them to handle. His heart sank. Soldiers. More soldiers. But these weren't the disorganized, panicked types Jack had seen earlier. These men were trained, disciplined, and ready. Before Jack could react, one of the soldiers raised a weapon, something bigger than a standard rifle, and aimed it directly at him. The metallic glint in the low light of the clearing made his stomach lurch. "Jack, don't!" Sarah shouted, stepping forward as if to shield him, but Jack already knew what was coming. His body moved before he could think, instinct overriding everything. He barely registered the sound of the shot being fired, the whoosh of air as it passed. The moment the projectile came into range, Jack's body was already responding. The nanobots inside him surged, tearing at his muscles, pulling him forward faster than his mind could keep up with. He reached the soldier in an instant, grabbed the barrel of the weapon, and tore it from the man's hands with a sickening crunch. But it wasn't enough. The hunger flared, the need to consume, to destroy, and without thinking, Jack reached out, his hands wrapping around the soldier's throat, pulling him in. His vision blurred again, the edges of the world warping as the nanobots urged him on. Sarah screamed behind him, but it didn't matter. He couldn't stop. He didn't want to stop, but just as quickly as it started, the hunger receded. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what he had almost done. The soldier in his grasp was still alive, but barely. Jack's hands were shaking, his breath ragged. His mind screamed at him to finish it, but something, someone, flickered through the fog of his thoughts. Sarah. He released the soldier immediately, his hands trembling as the man collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Jack turned to Sarah, his eyes wide with panic. She had seen him do it. Seen him become something else. Sarah, he couldn't finish. His throat closed up, the weight of what he had almost become pressing down on him. She didn't speak for a moment, her eyes locked on him, filled with something Jack couldn't quite read. But then she stepped forward, slow and cautious, her hand reaching out to him. "Jack," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I know what this is. But we can't give up. You can fight this. You just have to hold on." For a long moment, Jack just stood there, unable to move, unable to say anything. The nanobots inside him were still restless, still clawing at him, but Sarah's presence, it was like a tether, a lifeline. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on," Jack said, his voice thick with the truth of his own helplessness. "I don't know how much of me is left." Sarah didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Instead, she took a step forward and, without hesitation, wrapped her arms around him. She held him, as if to say without words, "I'm still here." And Jack realized, in that moment, that maybe that was enough. For now. But even as he closed his eyes and tried to calm the storm inside him, he knew the truth. They couldn't stay here much longer. The military was closing in. And Jack wasn't sure how much longer he would be able to keep the darkness at bay. Jack's body was shaking. He could feel the nanobots writhing inside him, restless and hungry, pulling at his skin, at his muscles, at his very thoughts. He had almost lost himself again, almost given in to the primal urge to consume. And yet, here he was, standing with Sarah, still holding on to whatever was left of the man he used to be. He pulled away from her embrace slowly, reluctantly, as if letting go of her meant letting go of the last part of himself that still felt human. Her eyes were filled with concern, but also something softer, something that kept him tethered to the reality he desperately wanted to cling to. "We can't stay here," Jack muttered, his voice ragged. "They'll be here any second. We've got to keep moving." Sarah nodded without hesitation, already scanning the trees, her eyes sharp, alert. They both knew time was running out. The rendezvous point had been a bust, and the military wouldn't give up. They had to move. Jack took a step forward, but his legs felt like lead. The hunger was clawing at him again, the nanobots screaming for him to tear apart anything in his path. But he forced himself to keep moving, ignoring the way his fingers twitched, the way his body burned with the desire to feed. He focused on Sarah, on her presence beside him, trying to ignore the voices in his head. "We're close," she said, her voice low but resolute. "Just a few more miles." But Jack didn't know if they had that long. The nanobots inside him weren't just a physical force, they were alive, they were aware, and they were growing stronger. Every passing second brought him closer to losing control again. The more they expanded, the harder it would be to keep himself together. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking through the fog of his thoughts. She was looking at him with concern, her hand hovering just beside his arm, as if she might reach out but wasn't sure whether to touch him. "I'm fine," Jack lied, his voice a little too rough. "I just need to keep moving." Sarah hesitated but didn't argue. She knew better than to push him when he was in this state, but she also knew that whatever was inside him, whatever he had become, was a ticking time bomb. And the longer they stayed, the more likely it was that the hunger would take over. They moved through the woods in silence, the only sound the rustle of the leaves beneath their feet and the distant hum of military vehicles. Jack's senses were on high alert, the steady buzz of his heightened awareness crawling under his skin. He could hear their engines now, closer than before. They were getting closer. "There's a clearing up ahead," Sarah said, her voice tight. "It's about a mile. I know a place we can hide out until they pass." Jack nodded, his throat dry. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He knew they needed to keep moving, but he couldn't help but feel like they were running out of time. The longer they waited, the stronger the urge inside him would get. The nanobots were relentless, and he could feel them, twisting through his bloodstream, whispering promises of power. "You could take them all on, Jack. You could be unstoppable." Jack clenched his fists, trying to drown out the voice. He couldn't let it win. Not yet. When they reached the clearing, it was eerily quiet. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the open space. The ground was soft, the grass underfoot heavy with dew. Jack could see the dim outline of a small building on the far side of the clearing, a dilapidated shack of some kind. But there were no signs of life. No signs of the extraction team. "They should have been here by now," Sarah said, her voice strained with frustration. "I don't understand. We've followed the plan. Why aren't they here?" "I don't know," Jack said, but the answer was already clear in his gut. They'd been set up. This whole thing had been a trap. The military knew where they were. They had always known. Suddenly, the quiet of the clearing was shattered by the distant sound of a helicopter. The thump of the blades cutting through the air was unmistakable, a low hum that grew louder with every passing second. "They weren't alone anymore. We need to move," Jack said, his voice urgent. He could feel the pulse of the nanobots again, a quickening thrum that matched the beat of his heart. The hunger was rising, and there was no stopping it now. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him to a nearby bush and dragging him down. "Get down," she hissed. "We can't be seen." Jack followed her lead, crouching low to the ground, his body screaming to move, to attack. But he couldn't. Not yet. The helicopter passed overhead, its lights sweeping across the clearing. The soldiers inside were searching, scanning for any movement. Jack held his breath, his body rigid, trying to stay as still as possible. He could feel the nanobots pushing, urging him to act, to do something, to rip and tear, to break free. But he forced himself to stay quiet, to stay hidden. They couldn't afford to be discovered. Not when they were this close. The helicopter passed, but Jack could hear the voices below, commanding, authoritative. They were searching the area, organizing their efforts. The military wasn't just after Jack anymore. They were after both of them. And there was nowhere to run. "They'll be back," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We're running out of time. We can't stay here." "We need to find the extraction point," Jack said, his voice low. "It's our only shot." Sarah nodded, her eyes darting around the clearing. She was already looking for the next step, already planning their next move. Jack admired her calmness, the way she was able to think clearly even when everything was falling apart. But even as he looked at her, Jack knew the truth. The military wasn't just going to leave them alone. They were going to send everything they had, everything they could, to hunt Jack down. And no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he tried to go, the hunger inside him was getting harder to control. It wasn't just the soldiers Jack had to worry about anymore. It was himself. The voice in his head was growing louder, more insistent. The nanobots were pushing him, filling him with a dark promise. Take them all. Destroy them. Consume them. You are more than human now. Jack could feel his hands trembling, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to hold back the urge to lash out. He was losing it. He was losing the fight. But then he looked at Sarah, and for the briefest of moments, the hunger subsided. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else, too, something deeper. Something that told him, even if he didn't believe in himself, she still believed in him. We'll get through this, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but filled with unspoken fear. We just have to keep going. Together. Jack nodded, forcing a breath through his clenched teeth. For now, that would have to be enough. Because, in the end, he knew one thing: he wasn't just fighting the military. He was fighting for his humanity. And if he lost that, there would be nothing left to save. The helicopter's thrum faded into the distance, but the tension in the air remained thick and suffocating. Jack could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to break. He had fought the urge to give in, fought the hunger that clawed at him, but it was becoming harder and harder. The nanobots were relentless, pushing him, pulling at his thoughts. They were more than just technology, they were a part of him now, and their whispers had become louder, more insistent. But Sarah's steady presence beside him kept him anchored. For all his fears, for all the dangers they faced, he wasn't alone. And that thought, simple as it was, gave him something to hold on to. We need to move, Sarah said again, breaking the silence, her voice tight but controlled. They'll be back soon. We don't have much time. Jack nodded, the weight of her words settling into his bones. The hunger was there, just beneath the surface, but he couldn't afford to let it control him. Not now. He had to focus. He had to keep moving, keep his mind sharp. They crept along the edge of the clearing, moving as quietly as possible. The brush at the edge of the trees was thick, but the darkness concealed them, offering a small semblance of safety. Jack's body was still on edge, every muscle coiled tight as he listened for the sound of movement, anything that could signal the presence of the military. They were close. He could feel it. Do you hear that? Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah paused, her head tilting slightly. She listened for a moment before nodding. Yeah, it's the sound of boots on the ground. They've got people searching the perimeter. We need to go around the other side of the forest. Jack's pulse quickened. He didn't need to be told twice. He reached for Sarah's hand, his fingers brushing against hers as he pulled her toward the far end of the clearing. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they had no choice. They couldn't stay here any longer. They moved fast, weaving between the trees and underbrush, trying to stay out of sight. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made Jack's nerves spike. He couldn't help it. The nanobots were constantly reacting to his heightened awareness, making him more sensitive to every sound, every movement in the environment. It was overwhelming, but he had to focus. He couldn't let it get to him. How much farther? Jack asked, his voice low. Not far, Sarah answered. Just stay with me. Jack's grip on her hand tightened, the connection grounding him, forcing him to stay present. His mind was fighting the urge to drift, to let the hunger take over, but he wasn't going to let that happen. He couldn't. Not while Sarah was still with him. they finally reached the edge of the forest and paused. A small dirt road lay ahead, stretching out in the moonlight. It seemed almost too quiet, too still, but Jack knew better than to trust appearances. The military had to be close, and they weren't the only ones looking for the extraction team. Whoever had set them up was still out there, and Jack wasn't about to let them take either him or Sarah without a fight. Which way? Jack asked, his throat tight. Left, Sarah replied, glancing around. It's a couple more miles to the extraction point. We can't afford to stop now. We keep moving until we reach it. Jack didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath and moved forward, his steps quick but measured. The hunger inside him, though dulled, still gnawed at the edges of his mind. He could feel it, like a black hole in his chest, but he wasn't going to give in. Not now. Not when they were so close. They traveled down the road, the silence between them stretching as their footsteps echoed in the quiet night. Every now and then, Jack would catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, but it was always too far away, too fleeting to be certain of. He couldn't help but feel like they were being watched, even though he couldn't pinpoint who or what was doing the watching. His senses were on high alert, but every second he spent waiting for an attack made the hunger inside him worse. "I don't think we're alone," Jack muttered, his eyes scanning the trees again. Sarah stopped and glanced around, her eyes sharp. "I know. I've been feeling it too." Jack's heart raced. Who else was out there? Suddenly, there was a sound ahead, footsteps, crunching the leaves and gravel. They weren't alone, and they weren't far. Jack tensed, his body going rigid as he prepared to act. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, "get behind me. Now." She didn't argue. In an instant, she was behind him, her breath shallow as she waited for whatever was coming their way. Jack's hand clenched into a fist, his body brimming with tension. He could feel the nanobots stirring again, almost as if they could sense the danger. It was almost too much. Then the figures appeared from the trees, emerging into the moonlight. "Don't move," a voice called out. Jack's heart dropped into his stomach. It was military, soldiers, just as he had feared. A dozen or more, each one armed and moving with purpose. "You're not going anywhere," one of them said, a smirk creeping into his voice. Jack's pulse surged as he fought to control his body, but the hunger inside him flared. His hands twitched involuntarily, and for a split second, he could feel the nanobots surging to the surface, responding to the threat. "Fight," they whispered. "Consume." "Jack," Sarah's voice was low but urgent behind him. "We can't fight them all. We need to run." But Jack didn't move. His body was frozen, caught between the need to protect Sarah and the overwhelming pull of the hunger. He could feel the soldiers closing in, their eyes locked on him, but something more dangerous was brewing inside him. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about losing control. "No," Jack finally said, his voice a growl. "We fight." Without warning, he launched forward, his muscles moving faster than his mind could keep up with. The first soldier didn't even see him coming. Jack reached him in an instant, his hand shooting out and grabbing the soldier by the throat. The nanobots responded immediately, tearing the man's weapon from his hands and twisting it into a useless mass of metal. The soldier gasped, his eyes wide in terror, but Jack didn't stop. The hunger surged again, overwhelming him. His fingers tightened around the soldier's neck, but then, just as quickly, the voice of Sarah broke through the fog in his mind. "Jack, no," she shouted, her voice shaking. "It was enough." Jack staggered back, gasping for air as his grip loosened. The soldier crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath, but Jack didn't have time to deal with him. The hunger was still there, clawing at his insides, but Jack's mind was clearing, just enough for him to remember who he was. "Sarah, go," Jack said, his voice ragged. "Run. I'll hold them off." She didn't argue this time. She turned and ran, and Jack followed, moving just enough to stay ahead of the soldiers, his body still screaming with the need to consume. The nanobots inside him were hungry, restless, but Jack was still in control, barely, and then, just as quickly as the soldiers appeared, they were gone. The sound of the chase echoed in the distance, but Jack didn't stop. He couldn't. He couldn't afford to lose this fight.